The elderly man in the faded coat, veteran's pin on his lapel, stood silently before the museum entrance where a ceremony honoring veterans was about to begin. "Your name isn't on the list. Please step aside," the attendant said quietly but firmly. He didn't argue, just silently retreated. But minutes later, the entire auditorium fell silent as the intercom crackled to life. "The ceremony is temporarily suspended. The most important person is still standing outside the door." If you believe gratitude should be expressed at the right moment, subscribe to hear more stories like this. Harold Green was an 84-year-old infantry veteran who had served with distinction in both the Korean and Vietnam Wars. His weathered face told stories his lips rarely shared, tales of courage, sacrifice, and the brothers in arms he had lost along the way. After his discharge, Harold had chosen a quiet life. He never sought recognition. Keeping his few medals in a simple wooden box, he occasionally opened on quiet evenings. His Purple Heart and Bronze Star remained tucked away, visible only to him during private moments of remembrance. One morning, Harold received a letter from the National Veterans Museum announcing a special tribute to honor ceremony for aging veterans. The elegant invitation mentioned a wall of remembrance where photos of fallen soldiers would be displayed, including members of his old unit. With careful hands that now trembled slightly with age, Harold polished his shoes, pressed his old uniform, and pinned his faded Bronze Star to his chest. He stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie with dignity, not vanity. For Harold, appearance wasn't about pride, but respect. Respect for those who wouldn't be there to wear their uniforms again. He took the bus across town, clutching his printed invitation in one hand and a small bouquet of flowers in the other. Not for himself, but for the memorial wall where his comrades' faces would be displayed. At the museum entrance, a sleek glass and steel structure, Harold presented his invitation to a young attendant who barely looked up from her tablet. "Name?" she asked briskly. "Harold Green, 38th Infantry Division," he replied with the crisp precision that had never left him. The attendant scrolled through the digital guest list, her manicured fingernail tapping impatiently against the screen. "I don't see you listed. Do you have your confirmation email?" Harold looked confused. "This is all I received," he said, holding up the paper invitation. "We've moved to a digital system," she explained with barely concealed impatience. "Without electronic verification, I can't allow entry. Security protocols." Harold fumbled in his wallet, producing an ancient military ID and service record. Documents yellowed with age but preserved with care. "Perhaps these will help verify." The security guard just shook his head without even examining the documents. "Current identification only, sir." A well-dressed man in an expensive suit pushed past, flashing a digital ticket on his smartphone. He glanced at Harold with obvious disdain. "Is someone clearing out these vagrants? This is supposed to be an exclusive event," he muttered loud enough for Harold to hear. Harold looked down at his perfectly pressed but undeniably aged uniform, suddenly aware of how out of place he must appear among the polished dignitaries and corporate sponsors filing into the building. Without another word, he stepped aside, dignity intact but heartbreaking, silently. From the corner where he stood, Harold watched as people streamed into the museum. None of them had been there that night in the jungle when half his unit was lost. None of them had held his friend Thomas as he died, whispering his mother's name. None of them knew why today, of all days, mattered so deeply to him. A small boy passing by with his father pointed toward Harold. "Dad, why isn't that soldier going inside?" The father glanced dismissively at Harold's worn appearance. "Not everyone who claims to be a veteran actually is, son. There are people who pretend for attention." Harold felt the words like physical blows. 50 years of silence, of carrying memories without complaint, and now to be dismissed as an imposter. It stung worse than any battlefield injury. As the doors closed for the ceremony to begin, Harold stood alone on the museum steps, the bouquet of flowers still clutched in his weathered hands. The names of the dead he had come to honor still unspoken on his lips. Harold found a bench near the museum entrance where he could rest his aching knees. He watched through the large glass windows as attendees mingled inside, sipping champagne and admiring the displays that chronicled the very wars he had survived. On the temporary stage erected inside, dignitaries prepared to speak about sacrifice and honor, concepts they understood in theory, but Harold had lived in blood and fear and courage. He wasn't angry about being excluded, Disappointment, yes, but not anger. What pained him most was that he had promised himself he would finally read aloud the names of his fallen comrades at the memorial wall, a private ritual of remembrance he had planned for this day, the 50th anniversary of the ambush that had claimed so many of his brothers. A young museum docent emerged from a side door, speaking quietly into her headset. She glanced at Harold, then quickly looked away when their eyes met. Harold heard snippets of her conversation. The old man without credentials is still outside. No, security already turned him away. Not our problem if he's not on the list. What no one realized was that Harold was the last surviving member of a unit that had faced a devastating ambush in the jungles of Vietnam. An operation so classified that many records remain sealed even 5 decades later. 23 men had died that night, with Harold alone surviving to carry their memory. Inside the museum, the ceremony was beginning. A congressman took the podium to speak about the importance of honoring veterans, his words broadcast on speakers loud enough for Harold to hear from his bench outside. "We must never forget those who served," the politician declared to enthusiastic applause. "Every veteran deserves our unending gratitude." Harold closed his eyes, the irony almost too much to bear. In the crowd inside, a young Army lieutenant named Michael Chen was scanning the historical photographs on display. He stopped abruptly before a black and white image showing a blood-soaked soldier carrying a wounded comrade through jungle terrain. The caption read, "Sergeant Harold Green, 38th Division, rescuing Lieutenant James Morris during the classified Operation Shadowbreak, 1970. Lieutenant Chen's head snapped up, his eyes searching the room. That same face, older, weathered, but unmistakable, had been outside the museum doors. The man they had turned away was the same soldier from the most famous rescue photo in his military academy textbooks. Pushing through the crowd, Lieutenant Chen approached the museum director, whispering urgently in his ear. The director's face paled as he realized their terrible mistake. He immediately contacted the colonel who was serving as master of ceremonies. Within moments, the colonel interrupted the congressman's speech, taking the microphone. Without explanation, he strode to the sound booth and connected his phone to the museum's intercom system. The speakers both inside and outside the building crackled to life with his authoritative voice. "This ceremony is temporarily suspended. I've just been informed that the most important person who should be here today is still standing outside our doors." The assembled crowd fell silent, confused murmurs spreading through the hall. Outside, Harold was just preparing to leave, tucking his undelivered flowers into his coat pocket, when the front doors of the museum burst open. The colonel himself emerged, flanked by several officers in full-dress uniform. Without hesitation, they approached Harold and rendered a formal salute that the old soldier had not received in decades. "Sergeant Green," the colonel said, his voice carrying across the now silent museum entrance, "on behalf of everyone inside, I extend our deepest apologies. No man who has served as you have should ever be left standing outside while we pretend to honor service and sacrifice. Some heroes quietly carry the weight of history without seeking the spotlight. Some sacrifices remain unsung, not because they're unworthy of praise, but because those who made them never thought to ask for recognition. If you believe that true honor is measured by actions rather than appearances, type honor in the comments below." The colonel personally escorted Harold into the museum amid a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Every person in the room, politicians, military officers, civilians, rose to their feet as the elderly veteran walked slowly down the center aisle. The master of ceremonies approached the microphone, his voice resonating with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, we must publicly apologize for an unforgivable oversight. The man who has just joined us is the reason many of us can be here today." On the large screen behind the stage, the photograph Lieutenant Chen had recognized appeared, showing a younger Harold in the midst of combat. The image was followed by military records, citations, and battlefield reports that had been rapidly assembled from the museum's digital archives. A military historian stepped forward, addressing the stunned audience. "Sergeant Harold Green is the sole survivor of Operation Shadowbreak, a mission so classified that most of its details remained sealed until just 5 years ago. When his unit was ambushed in 1970, Sergeant Green, despite being wounded himself, managed to drag 3 men to safety and hold off enemy forces for 4 hours until extraction arrived. The historian continued, "What the records don't show is that after returning home, Sergeant Green dedicated his life to preserving the memory of those who didn't make it back, never once seeking recognition for himself." Harold stood silently, his eyes fixed on the memorial wall where the faces of his fallen comrades looked back at him across the decades. The attendant who had earlier denied him entry approached, tears streaming down her face. "Sir, I am so deeply sorry," she whispered. Harold simply nodded, his expression gentle. "You were just doing your job, miss." An elderly woman rose shakily from her seat in the front row, making her way toward Harold. "You won't remember me," she said softly, "but I'm Elizabeth Morris. My husband was Lieutenant James Morris, the man you carried through 3 miles of jungle after he was wounded. He lived because of you. Our children and grandchildren exist because of what you did that day." The woman embraced Harold as the room watched in emotional silence. For the first time since entering the museum, Harold's stoic expression broke, tears welling in his eyes. The museum director approached the podium, visibly moved. Today's ceremony was meant to honor all veterans, but it has become abundantly clear that our focus on protocol and digital guest lists caused us to lose sight of the very people we claim to honor. He turned toward Harold. "Sergeant Green, would you do us the honor of speaking?" Harold slowly made his way to the podium, declining the microphone offered to him. His voice, though aged, carried clearly through the silent room. "I didn't come here for recognition," he began. "I came to honor the men who couldn't be here, to say their names aloud in a place dedicated to remembering." One by one, Harold recited the names of his fallen comrades, 23 men who had died during that fateful mission. With each name, he added the hometown they had spoken of during quiet nights on patrol, the dreams they had shared, the families they had left behind. Not a single eye remained dry in the auditorium. These weren't just names on a memorial wall anymore. They were sons, brothers, husbands brought vividly to life through Harold's perfect memory and deep love for his brothers in arms. When he finished, the silence was profound, broken only when a group of veterans in the audience rose and approached Harold. They had served in different wars, different decades, but they recognized in him the unbreakable bond that connects all who have faced combat together. The museum director returned to the podium, his voice thick with emotion. "The honor wall that we're dedicating today has been missing something essential." He gestured toward a covered section. "This space was reserved for a special dedication, but I believe its purpose has now been made clear." As the covering was removed, the audience saw a newly installed plaque that read, "Harold Green, Survivor, Witness, Keeper of the Flame." The director continued, "This plaque will stand as a reminder that honor isn't found in grand ceremonies or digital guest lists, but in the quiet dignity of those who serve and remember." A young child approached Harold, offering a hand-drawn card. "My teacher says we should thank veterans," the child said simply. "Thank you for being brave." Harold knelt down, meeting the child at eye level, despite his arthritic knees. "Just remember them," he replied softly. "That's all any of us really want." After the ceremony, Harold returned to his modest home on the outskirts of town. The humble space was unchanged, but something in Harold himself had shifted. For decades, he had carried his memories like a private burden. Now he had shared them and found that the weight had somehow lightened. But Harold's story didn't end with that ceremony. The ripples continued to spread. The museum established a special section dedicated to the operations Harold had participated in, featuring oral histories he finally felt ready to share. School groups regularly requested his presence, listening in rapt attention as he spoke not of heroism, but of friendship and duty. A permanent seat bearing his name was installed at the museum, right next to the memorial wall where his comrades' faces watched over visitors. The irony of having been denied entry to a place that now honored him daily was not lost on Harold, but he bore no grudges. On the wall above his favorite armchair at home hung a framed quote in his own handwriting: "Honor is not measured by invitations or name recognition. It is measured by how a nation remembers those who sacrificed everything for it." Each week, letters arrived from across the country, from veterans, from families of the fallen, from students who had heard his story. Harold answered each one personally, his penmanship still military precise despite his advancing years. The museum had changed too. A new policy ensured that no veteran would ever be turned away, regardless of documentation or appearance. The digital check-in system now included the simple question, "Have you served?" with staff trained to respectfully welcome those who answered yes. True recognition doesn't require spotlights or ceremonies. It needs only to happen at the right moment, in the right place, with genuine gratitude that transcends protocol. The greatest heroes often stand quietly among us, their sacrifices visible only in the freedom we enjoy and too often take for granted. If you believe that silent sacrifice deserves to be acknowledged with heartfelt thanks, subscribe to TT Hero Stories. TT Hero Stories, because some heroes never stop serving.